I'm going to level with you. You've caught me on a day where I'm in the middle of resetting my sleep schedule from one half of the day to the next. But part of that is so that I can do a lot of casting for you this weekend. I will be doing both the Europe/Southeast Asia and the North American versions of Duels of Runeterra. We're going to get started off with EU/SEA. That's going to be with a Wandering Bard. That'll probably be on my Twitch channel from the Boulevard, and that is going to be at 9 a.m. GMT. Then later on in the day, about 6 p.m. GMT, I'm going to move over to twitch.tv/shitjustworks and be with my usual co-caster, Shit Just Works. So look forward to that all weekend. And speaking of Duels of Runeterra being the sort of big tournament this weekend, it's not in a normal format. It is actually going to be trying out the one deck, side deck, 15 card sideboard, region locked, not really, because you can actually side deck, I think, 3 different regions. You might be able to go a full hog wild inside all 6 regions, though I don't think you'd do that. So we're going to be focusing on that format this week, which does mean that I'm not going to be looking at the tier list, which is fine because a new set just came out. The tier list would be a little bit wonky anyway. So instead, I'm going to get more into sort of a general side deck strategy, the kinds of decks that you can play, what the meta should look like, and things of that nature. So buckle up. So let's talk about the meta that you're going to be walking into this weekend. While the new expansion did just drop, so I can't speak on the specific meta that you're going to be seeing, in a broader sense, I do think there will be a lot less aggro than you would see in a typical 3-deck format. And one of the reasons for that is that there are a lot of anti-aggro side deck tools and almost no aggro side deck tools. We don't have anything like Rampaging Ferocidon, nothing that says players can't gain life, which is a pretty staple side deck tool for aggro decks across a lot of different card games. Silver Bullets, Floodgates, whatever you want to call them. And we don't have anything like that. And even if we did, it'd look pretty weird. It'd have to be burst speed, because if it was attached to a burn spell, then your opponent could just respond with all of their healing, and you wouldn't be able to respond with another copy of the Can't Gain Life because, well, it's all burst speed healing. So it'd have to be on a unit, something like the Ferocidon, and until we get something like that, I really don't think that aggro is a super viable tool for you in a format like this. There are a few exceptions. For example, I think Pirate aggro is really one of, if not the only, viable aggro decks, just because you do have the option to transformative sideboard into a different Noxus Bilgewater deck. I was trying to look at a deck list of Pirate aggro and a deck list of Twisted Fate Swain and see if I could cobble together 25 cards that are shared between the two, and honestly I couldn't. But if you were really dedicated to doing this, you could get it done if you want to play Pirate aggro and then, oh man, they switched in all this healing and all this removal. I'm playing against Shadow Isle and they sided in 3 Grasp and 3 Whale, so I moved over to TF Swain. Maybe that works for you, maybe it doesn't. It's kind of hard to say. It probably doesn't. But I feel like you're kind of kneecapping yourself if you do bring an aggro deck, and I'm sure someone will figure it out, but it's not something that I would recommend. I do feel like players are going to be very prepared for this. They're going to be a little overly cautious of it, and yeah, I just overall think that aggro is not in a good spot for a format like this, which does actually get to impact the kind of deck that you bring, because if you are bringing something like a late game control deck, you can actually build it really greedy for game number 1. And that's just sort of the after effect of not having cards like Rampaging Ferocidon in Legends of Runeterra. I definitely think that greedy control is going to be sort of the best deck of this format going into this weekend. Noxus Bilgewater and Shadow Isle Freljord have been tournament staples for quite some time, and I think that's going to remain true going into this one-deck format. Noxus Bilgewater is sort of the flexible mid-range strategy. You can even side into a more aggressive package if your opponent is going for a really greedy control deck. It's not going to be easy. It would take some doing, but I think it's a little bit easier to reverse engineer. For example, if you think that Noxus Nab is the deck to bring, and I'll just steal my opponent's side deck tools, then yeah, it's not unreasonable for you to, side deck out your TFs in for Misfortunes and put in a little bit more aggro, and that's maybe how you handle the greedy control decks. As for the control decks in the Shadow Isle Freljord, I think that Shadow Isle will be a part of those decks across the board. Maybe the Freljord comes in or out for something like Ionia. But these 2 regions do have very powerful side deck tools for a lot of different strategies. The Frostbite effect's very good in the mirror if your opponent's going for an atrocity type deal. All of the additional removal/healing spells. You can put in more Ruinations, more atrocities. Ladros is a phenomenal silver bullet for late game control decks. I do think these are going to be the 2 regional combinations that you're going to be seeing the absolute most of, especially with something like Sunk Cost getting added to Bilgewater, which I do think is a pretty reasonable side deck card, depending on what you think you're going to be playing against. It does sort of handle the Ladros a little bit. Not permanently, but a little bit. This is my tournament tier list that I reference in just about every video. I haven't updated it for the new set yet because this weekend is not your typical tournament, but I did kind of want to go down the decks that we saw last format and kind of explain how they do or don't fit into this format. Pirate aggro, as I had mentioned, a little bit too linear. Zombie Ash, not as flexible as the other Freljord Shadow Isle decks. Targon Lee Sin. Really, you're not getting a whole lot of great side deck tools out of Ionia and Targon. I feel like for the most part, it's just going to be cards that you are already main decking copies of that you would be putting in more copies of. You have some good anti-aggro tech, but for the most part, you're still not finding any removal in your side deck, and you are to split on Ionia Targon in order to take out one of those regions for a different one that has a little bit more removal for some of those matchups that you might need it in. Shen Fiora, this one's actually really flexible. Demacia has some really good side deck tools. I'm a big fan of it. I could see this one still popping up. Well, maybe it'll be the most popular Demacia deck. You know, it is a little bit weird. You can run Bannerman. That's what we saw in the original side deck format, was a lot of Bannerman that sided into a couple of different things, a lot of Lux decks even, as Demacia actually does have some pretty powerful side deck tools. War Mother's Control, in my opinion, this is probably one of the better decks for a tournament like this. You are a pretty safe strategy. You're pretty flexible in what you want to do. You can take out the War Mothers and the Tryndamirs and put in some more mid-game stuff if you're really worried about aggro. You know, you don't have to main deck things like Grasp and Whale because you can move them to the side, and you can really play for a greedy mid-range and control meta, which I do think you're going to be running into. Ramsol, kind of the same problem as Shen Fiora. You're really not getting, or not Shen Fiora, rather, Targon Lee Sin. You're really not getting any additional removal out of your side deck. You are kind of locked into those soft regions, as I'll come to call them. Frostbite midrange, yeah, you know, you got some cool stuff. Noxus has some really good side deck tools, especially Landmark Destruction, and I know that Soraka Tahm Kench is the deck that's kind of been on everybody's mind for a little bit. I personally haven't had any problems with it on ladder while running things like Twisted Fate Swain. I haven't even seen the animation for the Landmark because nobody's ended the game that way. Frostbite midrange, well, you get a little bit out of the Freljord section. Most of the tools that you're looking for out of the side deck of a Freljord deck are going to be Frostbite effects, which you're already running for the most part in your main deck, but Noxus actually is one of the better regions in terms of side deck potential. Scorched Earth added a lot to this deck, and I know that Targon Bilgewater, you know, the Tahm Kench Soraka deck is something that's been really popular on ladder. I don't know that even if you were running a 3-deck region-locked format this weekend, how much of that deck you would see, as it takes Targon Lee Sin and TF Swain off the table, which are two of the better decks in the format, and it could just end up getting banned. So Bilgewater really a power region still, as we didn't really see any nerfs to it. But the point is, I don't think you could run something like that in a side deck format. I think that deck is entirely too linear. Flexibility is kind of the name of the game when it comes to side decking, because remember, you are going to play more games with your side deck in than you are going to play without your side deck in. Because if you ever play a 3-game series, look, that's 2 games with your side deck in, and you will always only play 1 without it in. So your side deck really is sort of your lifeline in a tournament like this. If you've only played online card games and haven't side decked before, that is something to keep in mind. Dragons, probably a little bit too linear if you're all inning on it. If you are something that is like splashing dragons, I've seen a couple of decks that run just Shyvana, Screeching Dragon, and Fused Firebrand. I think that you've got some okay options. TF Swain, absolutely phenomenal. Bilgewater and Noxus, I think, have some really good side deck tools. Scouts, pretty linear. You know, you do get Stony Silencer, which will be pretty cool, but I don't think Scouts is good enough game 1 for you to want to do something like this. Maybe it will be one of the better aggro decks, but I think that Shen Fiora probably takes the cake on that one, especially with the addition of Nopify. If you do think that you're going to be running into something like that, I believe this is an open side deck, or open deck list tournament rather, so you will know what is in your opponent's side deck. So something like Nopify, you get a look at their side deck and decide if that's something that you need or want to bring in. Nab, very flexible, but also it's basically Noxus Bilgewater. Deep, I actually think, is going to be a really good deck for this format. It's always been pretty flexible in its matchups, and Bilgewater, Shadow Isle are 2 regions that I really respect for their side decking capabilities. You will have a little bit of trouble with landmarks, but I don't think you're going to be running into any landmark decks in this tournament, not only because the regions for the good landmark decks don't play very well in this meta, but also because people have access to landmark removal out of the side deck, and I don't think that that is a strategy that a lot of players are going to be comfortable running, so you don't really even have to worry about that. Nightfall, I think, doesn't really have good enough side deck tools and really only has a couple of good matchups. It's mostly used in region lock 2 pick on Lee Sin decks, which you're not going to be able to do here. Twisted Fate Ezreal decks actually aren't out of the question. While PNZ doesn't have great side deck tools, if you are running a really greedy control meta, Ezreal sort of is the counter to that. It is the inevitable late game, and maybe it's not TF Ezreal, maybe it's Karma Ezreal, so that you can go ahead and stall out some of the War Mother's decks and have denies and nopifies for these War Mother's calls and things like that. But I don't think Ezreal is necessarily out of the question, just because it will pair a little bit better into the meta, not necessarily off the strength of its side deck. And then the other decks in the tier 3, really not something that you're going to be seeing. Indoor Spiders, really not a flexible deck. You would be better off running some kind of other Freljord Shadow Isle deck, and Indoor Spiders is so far away from any other Freljord Shadow Isle deck in terms of the cards that are in it that I don't think you can do a transformative side deck type deal. Karma Ezreal, as I had mentioned, kind of in the same vein as TF Ezreal. Maybe I'm overestimating Ezreal. I tend to do that. We'll see. I don't think it's something that you should be running in this tournament. Like, if I were to give you an advice on like what I would run, Ezreal doesn't enter the conversation. And then discard aggro, way too linear. You'd be much better off running Pirate, I think. Piltover Zon, really not great in terms of side deck tools. As cool as it is to bring in Teemo in order to deal with some of these more late game decks that want to take it to turn 20, and it's like, what, I'll actually just all in on the Shroom package. That is something that a Piltover and Zon deck does have in this meta, and I think that's what would take up a lot of their side deck slot, if not something that they main deck, knowing that you are going into this meta, you are going to be playing against a lot of mid-range and control. Maybe you just main deck that, and it looks a little bit weird, but that's the cool thing about going into a tournament like this. You get to anti-meta a lot harder. So there's a lot of really in-depth concepts that unfortunately I'm not going to get to talk to you about, such as the ins and outs of side decking, the things that you think your opponent is going to side out and how you can side in for that, and most importantly when it comes to Legends of Runeterra, allegiance and side decking and sort of mixing and matching a bunch of regions. I really don't have time to get into all of that. Instead, I'm just going to show you some of my favorite side deck options from each region. That you might not have thought about. The NAB package, sure, you can throw that into anything. But no, I'm talking about things like Hired Gun. Hired Gun has a fair amount of good matchups, being able to give that vulnerable down onto something. Jawl Hunters, not necessarily a bad card if your opponent is running a Freljord deck and you don't really have removal for the Warding Stone on 3. Jawl Hunters really can get it done. All of this is kind of obvious. Sleight of Hand is a little bit wonky. I think this one is still a bait. It doesn't really matter what your opponent's running. This is not the kind of card that you generally can get away with. Abyssal Eye is actually something I've been thinking about a lot. If your opponent is running War Mother's Call and they go ahead and play Trundle on, 5, and then they've got the 3 mana left and I respond with an Abyssal Eye, I don't think you'd really put in your Grasp of the Undyings in this matchup if you were even side decking it to begin with. And Abyssal Eye is something that can really help something like a Twisted Fate Swain go ahead and keep up with these control decks that are going to be able to vengeance out the Swain and the Leviathan. What you really want to be doing in those kinds of decks is overloading your opponent with threats. You want them to constantly have to match up an answer with a threat, and generally it's going to take them 2 answers to deal with a threat if they're all high priority. For example, Swain is going to demand either a vengeance or 2 removal spells. Ruination is something that you need to be cognizant of, so something like this that'll help you maintain cards and is pretty low committal, not a bad choice. Citrus Courier. There's a couple of greedy matchups for the Citrus Courier, actually comes in really big. Double Up, really never going to come in. Mind Meld, also a bait. Scrap Shot, probably don't need it. Additional copies of Riptide Rex, sure. Sunk Cost, actually like this one a lot. Shipwreck Hoarder is another card that I really like against control decks. The treasures are very difficult for decks to outvalue. And of course, Smooth Soloist, this is a card that I've talked on in the past. If you are specifically running something like Twisted Fate Swain, Smooth Soloist actually gives you the option to get down Swain and Leviathan in the same turn, which does have a lot of value. Suddenly if your opponent taps out, you can develop this before they can get down the Ruination. I mean, as long as they fall below 9 mana, I don't think it's unreasonable for you to find yourself in a situation where you can play the TF and Swain in the same turn, then go for a big game-ending open attack. So those are kind of the Bilgewater cards that, maybe you start to think about when you're building out a side deck. Demasia's side deck options are really obvious, so I'm not going to get into them too much, but I did want to touch on Unyielding Spirit. Let's say you're playing something like a Shenfiora. Even if you don't plan on putting the Unyielding Spirit in your deck against control, I would still have it in the side deck, because it forces your opponent to respect it. Even if it's just 1 or 2 copies, if you can't think of the last things to put in, it really does fundamentally change the way that people have to play against you when they know that Unyielding Spirit is in your list, or could be in your list. Especially if you're running something like Shenfiora, where you have a lot of low-to-the-ground units and can still threaten that 8 mana while your opponent has to hold up manas for an answer, can really change the way that they play for an advantageous position for you to take advantage of. Ionia is another one where the side deck options are relatively obvious, but if you are playing something like Shen Fiora, don't be afraid to take the Fiora out of your deck if you're not playing against something where that win con works out. It helps if you have another 3-drop, you don't want to miss your curve still, you are still a tempo deck, but if you're playing against something where you don't think the Fiora win con is realistic, then maybe take it out for something like Karma. You know, move into a more spell-heavy late-game focused style of game, and of course Retreat is something that's going to come in to dodge all kinds of removal for War Mothers, you know, and when they throw out a Vengeance into a Retreat, it doesn't really matter the kind of unit that you're recalling, you're still going to feel good about something like that. You have Ghost even, Whimsy's a big one. Like I said, these ones are pretty obvious. You kind of get the gist just by looking at them. What is going to work out in what matchup is up to you, but you have a lot of options in Ionia, actually. Targon's kind of an awkward region when it comes to side decking because generally you're going to be main decking a lot of those cards anyway. Like, you're probably just throwing in extra copies of Hush, maybe some Celestial Generation to try and outvalue your opponent in the late game. But something that I did want to touch on is Starspring. If you're playing against a greedy control deck and it's Shadow Isle Freljord, you know they're not playing the Shadow Isle Landmark Destruction. You can actually try to side deck in a Star-Shaping Transformative sideboard and try to play to that win con. Not totally sure how well it's going to work out for you, but it is something to try and keep in mind in the back of your head if you can make it work out, because honestly I put no thought into it, and I'm not going to, but the concept is there. You can think about it a little bit harder than I did, but outside of that, yeah, everything in the Targon deck is pretty straightforward. You know, I don't think your opponent is necessarily bringing in the landmark removal that they had if it is in your side deck, and that kind of comes down to, did you win game one or not? Because like I said, I'm not getting into the psychology of side decking, that's for another time, but yeah, suffice it to say, I don't think it's the least viable thing I've ever said in my entire life. Of course, you've got Bastion, you know, all these different kinds of things. There's some really cool Targon side deck tools, but you can figure it out. Noxus, as I had mentioned, has some really obvious ones and is one of the better side decking regions, so I'm not going to get into it too much, but I will highlight Minotaur Reckoner. I think this card's actually just really good and kind of slept on right now. I'm not going to get up on a soapbox about it, but I do think that there are a lot of good matchups for this card, not even for its effect necessarily, but because it is a 6/6, and I think of the effect more as a pseudo-fearsome in a lot of cases, just because, oh yeah, you know, I'm not getting a lot of value off of stunning your 1/2, but it is, you know, a chump blocker out of the way for my Minotaur Reckoner, so if that was your only chump blocker, then you have to block with something a little more impactful, and it's probably not trading with my Minotaur Reckoner. It's a little awkward against ramp, because they do have wording stones and things like that, but if you are putting in the Calling Strikes and maybe even the Reckonings to try and deal with something like that, then I do think this can actually just start hitting some big guys if you are in that sort of greedy late game control meta where they're just pillaring up on like one Tryndamere or a Trundle. It gets a little awkward when that pillar gets down, but as I had mentioned, you know, you've got your Calling Strike that you can put in for things like that, but you know, something to keep in mind. I really like this guy. I actually can't get into Piltover and Zaun side deck tools because Piltover and Zaun is not a generic region. It's very streamlined from strategy to strategy, and the strategy that you are bringing with your Piltover and Zaun greatly affects your side deck choices available to you in this region. So I'm just not even going to try and get into this one. I trust that if you are big braining it enough to bring a PNZ deck, you've thought very hard about your side deck options. And then yeah, Shadow Isle has an insane amount of side deck tools. We're also going to skip over this one. So maybe I wasn't the most helpful in telling you what side deck cards are going to be relevant, but what I do want to talk about is the actual decks that we'll be seeing. I keep mentioning, oh, I think this is going to be a really greedy control meta. And I think the 5 most popular decks that we're going to see are Deep, some kind of Noxus Bilgewater. It's really up to player's choice of that one. Same thing with the Shadow Isle Freljord, though I'm definitely leaning more towards War Mothers for that one. Targon Lee Sin, and honestly, Demacia is kind of a question mark for me. I don't know if Lux decks are going to be more popular or if we're really looking at Fiora Shen still. Generally, Fiora Shen obviously is better well poised into the meta, but Lux decks tend to really shine when they get to take advantage of something like the side deck, as well as a total or more or less total lack of aggro within the meta, which is why I also think that Targon Lee Sin is going to shine, despite not having as effective side deck tools as some of the other regions. And there's not a whole lot that you can side against Targon Lee, and it'll be interesting to see what players adapt. If this is, let's say that these were the decks coming in, right? Do you cut Vile Feast and Unspeakable Horror from your War Mother's Call deck? What are you realistically going to use them on in a field like this? But you do still have to side deck them because you need some kind of removal for Bastion spell shields. Things are going to get really interesting this weekend, and you know, normally I like to talk on statistics and anecdotes and what we've seen in the past, and we haven't seen tournaments like this really all that much. Cephalopod did just win a Legends of Runeterra subreddit one deck side deck tournament with War Mother's Calls, so that's another sort of baseline to go off of in terms of what you're going to be seeing this weekend. I didn't get any of the other lists from that event, unfortunately, but I do think this is a pretty solid representation of what we should be seeing a lot of. I don't think that Tom Kench Soraka is going to make the cut. As I mentioned, the deck's just a little bit too linear. And Deep, I really do think, is a dark horse for this event. The matchup spread that it has is great, as well as the side deck tools available to it. So I kind of wanted to end this one by telling you what I would be playing this weekend, and I think I would be going for Deep, and this is sort of the baseline side deck that I think I'd be going for. Lure of the Depths helps you out-tempo some of the control decks. Passage Unearned just seems really good against War Mother's Call, especially because it gets to obliterate, so I get to deal with things like Ladros and Tryndamere a little more effectively. 2 Riptide, so that I can shuffle things back into my opponent's deck. That's Riptide, not Riptide Rex. I didn't abbreviate. 2 Rekindler, in case I run into some kind of spooky Karma or really, really grindy control deck. 2 Ruination to help deal with things like TF Swain. And 3 Unspeakable Horror to help pop spell shields on things like Lee Sin. Of course, this is just a pretty standard deep deck that I'd be running. You know, I cut Thorny Toad because I don't think I'm going to be seeing aggro. I kept in Deadbloom Wanderer because I'm going to be tossing a lot, and that's one of the more effective tools for doing that. But yeah, personally, I mean, that's just preference. I've been a big fan of Deep for a while. It's a deck that I'm very comfortable on, so I think that's what I would run in. But this is definitely a weekend where you want to pick comfort and then just kind of grab those cards that you think, oh man, if I only had this in this matchup, then I'd be great. You know, do prepare for aggro. As much as I keep saying you shouldn't really be expecting it. I've been wrong before, and I'm not willing to bet your tournament life on me telling you that there's going to be 0 aggro in this tournament, but I do think that when you kind of sit down and think about it, it makes a fair amount of sense. It's a logical conclusion that aggro wouldn't perform super well in a side deck format, but you know, if you take it then one step further, oh, nobody's prepared for aggro, you bring aggro, you have a great time. We'll have to see, because there are some options for transformative sideboards with a couple of aggro decks, and I'm really curious to see how it plays out. But that's actually all I have for you guys this week. I'm sorry if it wasn't as deep and informative as you wanted it to be. As I had mentioned, I'm kind of resetting my sleep schedule, so I'm a little tired, and I do apologize for that affecting my content, but I thought it was important to get this out regardless. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. I am going to be casting all weekend, as I had mentioned a little bit earlier. So my name is Boulevard, and until next time, as always, good luck in your tournaments.